Nobody saw coming Val Kilmer's last message before he died at age 65, and once you hear it, you'll understand why. People will never forget how he battled illness, lost his voice, and fell out of the public eye for years. But in his last moments, he recorded something quiet, haunting, and deeply personal. It wasn't meant for cameras, and it wasn't part of a movie, according to reports. It was a farewell unlike anything Hollywood had ever seen, and now pieces of it are finally coming to light. Don't go away until you hear the truth about what Val Kilmer really left behind. It's both sad and powerful. News of Val Kilmer's death arrived quietly, but the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He passed away on April 1st. 2025 at the age of 65. Official reports confirmed the cause pneumonia. Though Val had overcome throat cancer years earlier, the damage to his body had been profound. He had spent his final years largely bettered away from the spotlight that had once defined him. The illness hadn't taken his mind or his spirit, but his health had steadily declined. As word of his passing spread, so did the tributes from co-stars, directors, artists, fans, and even people who had only known him through his roles. The industry that once wrestled with his intensity now bowed its head in respect. The man who had played Jim Morrison, Batman, Doc Holliday, and Iceman was gone. Tom Cruise was one of the first to speak publicly just hours after the news broke. Cruise took the stage at CinemaCon in Las Vegas. He interrupted his own presentation, visibly moved. "I can't tell you how much I admired his work and him as a human being," Cruise said before leading the entire room in a moment of silence. No music, no applause, just a long pause. It wasn't a PR gesture, it felt personal because it was director Michael Mann, who worked with Kilmer on Heat, described him as brilliant, possessed, and deeply committed. He said, "While working with Val, I always marveled at the range, the brilliant variability within the powerful current of his characters. He was a storm of a performer, and you could feel it in every scene." Sharon, who had a relationship and a close friendship with Kilmer, wrote on Instagram, "I will miss you. You were funny, crazy, a pain in the ass, a great friend, as brilliant as Mark Twain, and brave here during your illness." The post went viral not because it was polished, but because it felt real. Anyone who knew Val Kilmer knew that he was a mix of genius and chaos. He could be difficult, but he was never dull. Josh Brolin also posted a short message. "See you soon, friend. I'll miss you." Other people followed. Jim Carrey, Kevin Bacon, Jennifer Tilly, and others all shared their thoughts. Carrey, who had starred opposite him in Batman Forever, called him a generational talent, and said he left behind an enviable legacy of unforgettable performances. But beyond the sound bites and the praise, there was a different tone this time, something heavier, something unsaid. Fans picked up on it quickly. The way people spoke about Kilmer wasn't just mournful, it was as if they were all carrying the weight of something else, something more intimate, something final. Of course, many remembered that Kilmer had lost his voice years earlier after undergoing a tracheostomy during his cancer treatment. Speaking became painful, nearly impossible for a man who once delivered entire monologues with nothing but his eyes and tone. This silence had felt tragic, but he adapted. He used text-to-speech tools, he wrote, he made art, and still he stayed connected through his paintings, his poetry, his social media. And yet there was one message he hadn't shared, not yet. The tributes, all of the memories, even the most honest ones, seemed to revolve around an unsaid thing that was waiting to be said. It would be easy to think that Val was just talking out of sadness, but those closest to him say that he had planned something small and simple and filmed it long before anyone knew how close the end really was. But that moment hadn't come yet, and when it did, it would catch everyone off guard. The man behind the mask, before he was Batman, before he was Iceman, before the news stories and the health battles. Val Kilmer was a theater kid from Los Angeles with a dream that burned a little brighter than most. At the time, he was the youngest person to ever be accepted into Juilliard's prestigious drama program, and it didn't take long for everyone to realize that he wasn't just another actor looking for fame. He was looking for something deeper. He wasn't the type to smile for the camera if he didn't feel like it, which made him unpredictable and unforgettable. Kilmer broke onto the scene with Top Secret, a goofy comedy that showed off his surprising singing voice and offbeat comedic instincts, but he didn't stop there. He shifted gears in real genius, then transformed into a brooding Jim Morrison in The Doors by the time Tombstone came out, with Val slurring out, "I'm your Huckleberry." As the dangerously cool Doc Holliday, it was clear he had range, serious range, but with that talent came a reputation. Kilmer was known for being intense on set, difficult even. Directors whispered about clashes, co-stars rolled their eyes behind closed doors on the set of The Island of Dr. Moreau. Things allegedly got so bad that director John Frankenheimer swore he'd never work with Kilmer again. Joel Schumacher, who directed him in Batman Forever, once described him as childish and impossible. Val, for his part, never denied being passionate, he just didn't like to fake it. "I would get upset when I felt a scene was being done poorly," he said years later. "If you're not there to make something great, then why are you even there?" That question followed him around his whole career. He wasn't in it for the money, and he wasn't one to play nice just to get another part. He was always after something more honest and true, and that made him hard to deal with at times. But people who knew him well said he was a painter, poet, father, friend, and person who left long voicemails full of philosophical ramblings and half-finished ideas. He'd disappear for months and then come back with a bunch of photos or a weird short film he made on his phone. He had a new way of seeing the world, and he never stopped trying to catch it. People started to see a softer side of him. When his 2021 video comes out, built from thousands of hours of personal footage he'd recorded since the 1980s, Val's film wasn't a comeback. It was a confession of insecurity and regret about the life he'd lived and the parts he wished he could relive. You could see it in his eyes. The intensity that made him difficult on set was the same force that made him magnetic on screen. It wasn't about control. It was about care. He never stopped creating, even when speaking became difficult after the tracheostomy. He lost his voice but not his drive. He continued to write, post online, make digital art, and quietly show up in the lives of those who were still following him. Not always smooth, not always meant for anyone else, just to store away parts of himself. That detail would become important later, because most people were still focused on the Hollywood look, the capes and shades, the funny lines. Val Kilmer had been filming something much more personal, something he wasn't ready to share until the very end, his quiet comeback. By the time Val premiered in 2021, Val Kilmer had already disappeared from the red carpets and magazine covers. But this wasn't a disappearance. It was a transformation. After years of keeping his health problems mostly private, the documentary was the first time he pulled back the curtain and let the world in. What they saw wasn't just an aging actor. They saw a man who had been quietly reinventing himself from the inside out. He didn't sound or look the same, but he was more himself than ever. Val wasn't your typical Hollywood retrospective. It was put together from thousands of hours of home videos, old audition tapes, behind-the-scenes videos, and very private records. Most of it was shot by Kilmer himself. This wasn't someone else's version of his story. It was his own, which was messy, broken up, and poetic. The documentary wasn't trying to restore his image, it was trying to reveal his soul. Audiences were taken aback. People had expected nostalgia, maybe a few heartfelt moments about his early career. What they got instead was a raw look at a man facing mortality, reckoning with his choices, and trying to find peace in the ruins of fame. There were shots of Val struggling to speak, his voice altered by surgery. There were scenes of him laughing, painting, joking with his kids, talking to fans. It wasn't glossy. It was human, and that vulnerability struck a chord. Suddenly the narrative around Kilmer began to shift. He wasn't just the moody actor who clashed with directors or walked Offsets. He was the artist who'd kept creating long after the world stopped watching, the man who lost his voice but found another way to speak, the Hollywood rebel who traded scripts for sketches, red carpets for quiet corners of art galleries. Even the industry began to circle back. He received new recognition not for a comeback performance, but for his honesty. There was something brave in the way he showed up on screen, damaged but still present, still searching, and that bravery made people look. Again, many people didn't know that Kilmer had been getting ready for this change for a long time. Before the documentary, he had been recording himself for projects, and just to keep track of his life. He had boxes and boxes of tapes, external hard drives, voice memos, video diaries, and scribbled notes on the backs of scripts. For years, he had been archiving moments. Not all of it made sense or could be used, but it was there as a record of a life lived loudly and quietly. Those closest to him said it wasn't about leaving a legacy. It was about expression. When speaking became hard, he found other ways to talk to people. His art, his blog posts, and his one-on-one talks with fans and friends, sometimes just with a. Most people thought he had retired from the spotlight, but Val had actually just switched stages. The release of Val didn't start a second act in the usual sense. He wasn't booking talk shows or new blockbusters, but it did open a door. People were listening and watching again, and in that space, he kept creating carefully and privately. There were times in Val that felt like a goodbye, but they weren't yet. The film may have been his most honest work, but it wasn't his last. Somewhere in all those recordings and thoughts he saved for later, there was one message he hadn't shared, and that message would become the moment no one saw coming. In 2022, the Iceman will be back. Many people thought that Val Kilmer's last movie appearance was this one. It was the kind of full circle moment that Hollywood normally only dreams of. 36 years after playing Tom Iceman Kazansky for the first time in Top Gun, he came back for the sequel Top Gun, Maverick. But this time, the swagger, the sharp jawline, the smirk, and the challenge in his eyes were all gone. What was there instead was gravity. Adding Iceman to the sequel wasn't just for nostalgic fan service. It was a tribute, a goodbye, and maybe even a well-chosen curtain call for Val. His part in the movie is short but memorable. Like Kilmer's real-life health problems, Iceman, who is now an admiral, is dealing with a serious disease. He can't talk much anymore and instead types words on a screen to talk to Maverick. When he finally does speak out loud, it's only a few lines, helped by AI technology that used old records of his voice to recreate it. The voice sounds like Val's, but it's not really Val. That strange mix makes the moment hit even harder. Tom Cruise and Kilmer didn't rehearse the scene. Over and over, according to those on set, they barely needed to the weight of real-life friendship. The passage of time and everything Kilmer had endured brought a quiet intensity to the scene. You could feel it before a word was spoken. When Maverick walks into that room and sees Iceman, audiences around the world did the same thing. They leaned in, not just because of who was on screen, but because of what it meant. This wasn't just a reunion, this was a goodbye, wrapped in character, cloaked in fiction, but entirely real underneath. Director Joseph Kosinski later said, "It was incredibly important to Tom and to all of us that Val be in the film. This story wouldn't feel whole without him." For Kilmer, the return wasn't about reclaiming the spotlight. He didn't need to prove anything. He already had decades of performances that spoke louder than he ever could. Now this role was about presence, about being seen, about finishing what he started. The studio used artificial intelligence to rebuild his voice. For the film, a voice synthesis company used hours of old recordings to make something that sounded a lot like Kilmer's original voice. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, and more importantly, it gave him a voice again, even if it was only for a few minutes. Fans were shocked, some cried, others cheered, and social media was full of messages like, "That scene broke me and I wasn't expecting to feel this much." Most people didn't know that Val had a lot to do with creating that scene. It wasn't something that was done to him, it was something that was done with him. He helped write the lines, he wanted it to feel honest and open, and it did. After Top Gun Maverick, he didn't come back for any major projects. No press tours, no acting announcements, just quiet and a sense that he had said what he needed to say on screen, but off screen he still had more to share, and while the movie marked the closing of one chapter, it didn't close the book. There was still something waiting, tucked away in a phone, captured in a video, shared only when the timing felt right, and that message would come not with a Hollywood score or a studio budget, but with silent stillness and a whisper of goodbye, a life in fragments. In the last years of his life, Val Kilmer communicated through fragments, pieces of poetry, sketches, Instagram posts, voice-assisted videos, and cryptic captions that often left fans reading between the lines. After the world watched Top Gun Maverick, many assumed that would be the final word from Kilmer, but those who followed him online knew better. Something about the way he used social media felt deliberate, like he was still building towards something. His Instagram feed wasn't typical celebrity fare. You wouldn't find behind-the-scenes movie teasers or polished endorsements. Instead, it was a mix of watercolor paintings, old behind-the-scenes photos, abstract art, scripture verses, and the occasional cryptic selfie, some taken long ago, others hard to date, and every so often there'd be a video, never flashy, always quiet, always strange, in that unmistakably Val Kilmer way. One of the most talked about came in February 2025, just a few weeks before his death. In the short clip, Kilmer is seen sitting beside artist David Cho, placing a Batman cowl on his head. Cho tells him, "You look great." It's hard to hear Kilmer say, "I'm ready." People who saw the video went crazy online and thought it was a sign that he was coming back. Something big was happening, or this was the end. What no one knew at the time was that the video wasn't new. It was actually filmed years ago. According to reports, Kilmer had saved a lot of private videos, voice memos, and even journal-style recordings that he made on his phone. Some were performances, some were rants, and some were emotional confessions. He never said exactly what he planned to do with them. Maybe he didn't know himself, but he kept making things even after the world stopped wanting someone who had been famous. Val's later years were surprisingly quiet. He didn't follow the news or go on talk shows, but he paid attention and stayed connected to life, not Hollywood. He used his art, his feed, and his camera to capture little bits of what he saw. In one post, he shared a picture of a cactus growing out of cracked pavement with the caption, "Resilient." In another, he shared a picture of his hand covered in paint with no explanation. Each post felt like a breadcrumb, a part of something bigger. He wasn't telling a story, just leaving one for those who were interested. But behind the public-facing account, there was more. People who knew him said he often filmed private messages on his phone, some of which he sent to friends and others he just stored. He'd film while sitting in bed, drawing, and watching old movies. There was no script, no lighting, just moments. Kilmer had been recording everyday life for years, even when he was becoming famous. He was always behind a camera, archiving and saving, not for fame or control, but maybe for connection. That's what made the later footage and unseen clips so powerful. They weren't edited for the spotlight, they were personal, and as his health got worse, it became clear to those around him that he was getting ready to leave behind something final. Not a performance, not a movie, something else. What remained in those last months was quiet, but it wasn't empty, because those phone fragments contained a message. The last word. Val Kilmer became more and more quiet in the days before he died. He was surrounded by close friends, his children, and a nurse who had become like family. He could barely move and could no longer speak in his own voice, but he stayed alert, his eyes still curious and full of life. Then, one evening, those closest to him say he picked up the phone and recorded a final message. It wasn't shared online and wasn't meant for the world at first, but word of it eventually got around from people who had seen it, heard it, and been moved by it. Val Kilmer's sad last message before he died at age 65 was read by an AI-assisted voice. Val said gently, "If you're hearing this, I've already left, but don't be sad. I've lived 1,000 lives and I loved them all, even the hard ones." He stopped and said, "The silence never scared me. What scared me was not being heard, but you heard me. That's enough." He ended with a whisper that was hard to hear even with speech recognition. "Thank you, I love you all, and don't forget to dream," he said. Reports say the message was short but haunting. There was no dramatic music or background noise, just the sound of a man who had spent his whole life changing into other people finally speaking as himself. David Muir, anchor of ABC World News Tonight, said, "This is so sad, but it reminds us of the depth of a man we thought we already knew." The message wasn't meant to be made public. It was saved on his phone, found by his family later, and shared quietly among those who loved him. And maybe that made it even more powerful. It wasn't about making headlines or leaving a legacy. It was about closure and connection. This wasn't a Hollywood ending. There were no cameras, scripts, or lights. Just Val with nothing but his thoughts and the soft glow of a phone screen. Val Kilmer's last message before he died at age 65 is heartbreaking, not because it's sad, but because it's honest. It captured everything. He was an actor, a poet, and a man who fought for his voice and then found another way to speak in the end. It wasn't about the roles or the fame. It was about being heard one last time and choosing his own terms. In that quiet last moment, he said everything. If you knew this was the last time anyone would ever hear your words, what would you say?